Well, the significance of the conference is that they've been able to have 10 of them. And I had the great privilege of being at the first conference, and my opening comment was that I'd waited 30 years for that conference because nobody was presenting on an international level the skeptics' view of what's going on. And of course, in science, you've got the proponents and the skeptics. That's always the case. And so the public were only hearing one side of it. And so for this conference to survive, and I know the attacks they've been under, because I've gone through it, I've had 4 lawsuits. So to have 10 of them is tremendous, and to have the turnout and the interest that there is. And I've watched over that, or in fact over 40 years or more, people gradually starting to realize that they're being misled. And I think this conference in Washington will bring the world's attention to that.
How do you account for the fact that they can push the notion of CO2 as a major danger to the public?
Well, if that's what you set out to do, that's what you do. As you know, manipulation through the media and through the politicians are superb at it. And the way they did it was that they wanted to focus on CO2 because they wanted to blame industry and industrial development for overuse of resources. But actually the climate is not their intent or their concern. The real concern is overpopulation. And so that they started through the Club of Rome with the idea that overpopulation and then industrialized nations chewing up the resources at too rapid a rate, an unsustainable rate, and that's where the term unsustainable development came from. And so they decided they had to shut down industries. Well, how do you do that?
That's
well, the
strong,
answer is
Maurice Strong.
Maurice Strong, exactly, yeah. And by the way, I've met him. I know people that work with him. I know people who work for him. The damage that man's done to the world, and now he's hiding out in China because of what he's done. But
do you think he's affecting China policy? Will he affect China policy, Strong?
No. Nobody affects China's policy. China does.
He hasn't got the ear of anybody there.
Oh, he has the ear, but he just they just say you want an apartment, you got an apartment, you know, and nobody tells China what to do.
Why wouldn't they fix on pollution as a problem rather than just CO2?
Well, they do fix on pollution. You hear Obama saying carbon pollution, and I watched that come in about 20 years ago, because they started to realize that people didn't understand the science of climate, but they understood about pollution. And of course, the term carbon pollution is a scientific contradiction, because carbon is a solid, it's not a gas, it really means CO2, and CO2 is not a pollutant. So that's their problem. And but that's why CO2 became the focus, and it was done through the definition of climate change that Maurice Strong set up at through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago was I used to think commissions of inquiry were hey, great, get the politics out of the issue. But what they actually do, and I learned this the first time I was appointed to a commission of inquiry, is it takes the politician off the hook, because then they can say, oh no, we have to wait for the inquiry report. The second thing is that they control it through the terms of reference. So the first commission I was on, the terms of reference were so narrow that there was only one result we could come up with. Well, that's what Strong did. So when they defined climate change as only human causes of climate change, then that rule out the sun. And of course, they could rule out water vapor, which is the most important greenhouse gas, because they could say, well, the amount of water vapor humans add is so minuscule compared to the large amount. But CO2 is a different issue. So everything was deliberately designed to focus on CO2.
And you really have to keep people stupid. I mean, dumb down. Really.
Oh, of course. But you see, and as I'm going to talk about in my presentation, by doing that definition, you then isolate the skeptics who are going to be around, because science is about skepticism. And so you could marginalize them very quickly, and as happened with me, and the term global warming skeptic was done because they knew the public didn't realize that for science, a skeptic is a different animal, completely different, yeah. And of course, what happened was, and it happened to me about 8 years ago in the Times of London, when their hypothesis of CO2 going up and temperature going up stopped, the pause, then they, instead of going back and examining the science, which proper science would do, they changed the names, and it went from global warming to climate change, and it went from global warming skeptic to climate change denier. And the term denier was deliberately chosen because at the time they started using it, Holocaust denial was a big thing in the news at that time. And so to align these climate people with deniers was part of the game. So yeah, the whole thing's been orchestrated and manipulated.
Do you think they're getting ready for COP21 and this kind of assault on what's going on?
Well, that's the theme of my talk, is that their whole job has been to isolate and demonize the skeptics. And I've had 4 lawsuits because my problem was that they couldn't say I wasn't qualified, and I had an ability to explain to the public what was going on and what the science was. Because
Michael Mann is one of these guys.
he's one of the ones that sued me, but I think the more important one is Andrew Weaver. And Weaver, of course, was the computer modeler guy on 4 of the IPCC reports. And it's through the models that they've achieved showing scientifically that CO2 is causing the problem. So the models, people talk about garbage in, garbage out, but for me, with the models, it's gospel in, gospel out.
Why is not geoengineering factored into the understanding of the critics of the official story?
Well, because it's a step beyond. The term geoengineering and the public are confused with that.
What about just chemtrails?
Well, the chemtrails issue is seen as a separate issue by the public.
But
you get into
the skeptics of the official story should factor in the chemtrail thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But it's already it got hauled away as a separate issue. For a lot of the public, chemtrails and that kind of government manipulation of the environment is much more in the UFO category. They can't believe that governments are doing those sorts of things.
But it's so evident on a regular basis.
Oh, well, but you see, the geoengineering, if you think about it, when they first started doing rain dances to make it rain, that was geoengineering. And the public are aware of that. Cloud seeding was another issue that went on back in the 50s and 60s. Hail suppression. People are aware of things, but they don't think about them as geoengineering. But it.
Do you think it's a factor in alternating and changing the climate, the geoengineering that they're doing, say with HARP and so forth?
No.
You don't
No.
think they're
The scales of energy. And by the way, I know all about this because I worked out of the rocket range at Churchill where they were firing up rockets into the ionosphere and so on. Yeah, there's no question that they've been cloud seeding and chemtrailing, and they also dropped massive amounts of iron filings across the North Pacific Ocean to try and increase the rate of CO2 absorption. But none of it's made any difference.
You think they believe their own story then?
Of course they do.
Wow, that's amazing.
Oh, yeah, but that's
part of the dumbing down of scientists.
If you've made a career out of it, you've got to believe it, and you've got to make other people think you believe it. And that's what it's about. And there's a quote by Tolstoy that said, if you spent your whole career trying to convince people of something, it's very difficult to believe to tell yourself you were wrong. And it's also then very difficult to convince other people, because this is the problem, you see. One of the things that Strong did, and he's an evil genius, but he's a genius nonetheless,
Amazing.
his ability to recognize that the real power is in bureaucracies. And Mary McCarthy made that comment about bureaucracy is the rule of nobody, the modern form of despotism. And it's so true. So he deliberately, and again, I've talked with people, Elaine Dewar, for example, who interviewed him.
I read her book.
You
recommended her book.
Oh, yeah. He deliberately set it up through the World Meteorological Organization, because then it gave him control of the national weather agencies in every country in the world.
Another factor, though.
Yeah.
The chemtrails, apparently they're spraying aluminum, barium, strontium. These are part of that whole agenda of essentially population reduction, wouldn't you think?
I don't think it's directly population reduction. I think that no. I think that those things are more attempts to see if they can modify or control the weather.
Really? So
Yeah.
you think that's primarily their objective with chemtrails?
In that.
And they're
in
not
that.
having any effect?
No. No, I mean, locally you can see some minor effect because cloud cover has an effect. We know that, but no, I mean the scales. I was talking with somebody yesterday, you know, and they were talking about this blob off of the coast of the Pacific on the west coast, and he showed me the calculations of how much energy to create the heat in that blob, 1,000 mile by 1,000 mile, 300-foot deep blob, and then he showed a volcano that's very close. And of course, geothermal energy. And the reason I'm saying this is because when you start looking at the economies of scales of energies involved, human contribution, I mean, it's just, it's arrogant almost to believe that we can do these things. And I watched this with cloud seeding, you know, hail suppression, all of these things. There's more energy in a single thunderstorm than in 25 nuclear bombs.
But, I mean, do you factor in HARP and its ability to redirect the weather? And, I mean, apparently off California, rain's being redirected north and south.
No, I don't. What's happening is if you don't know and ignore the natural variations of weather, then, you know, you can attribute these things to something humans are doing. So it's more by default than in any actual event. But again, that in the definition that Strong gave them of looking at only human causes, I've watched over the 40 more years I've been in it, what I call the fads that come in. I remember when El Nino, and it really began, I'd known about it. It had been studied. The Spanish knew about it in the Pacific Ocean. The Aztecs and Inca knew about it, sailing to Galapagos. But then suddenly it hit California because instead of normally in its Central America and Northern South America, it shifted north and hit California. And we live in a world where if something affects California, it affects the whole world. That's why El Nino came into the general public knowledge. But the public are left to believe that this is something new, that this, because we just discovered it must be something humans have done, and it's simply not the case at all. And I even, by the way, the 1998, which of course that spike of warming that they keep pointing to, I have questions about whether that's El Nino related.
A quick question about the attacks.
Yeah.
The attacks have been from from Gore, and from many others.
Yeah.
Very specific and mean-spirited. How do you account for that hostility?
Well, because people like Gore, and he's part of the modern, they're professional politicians, you know, and never held a job, and can't do anything else, and the easiest thing is become a politician and sit in meetings and pontificate.
And believe your own story.
And believe your own story. And of course, so if you're going to be a politician, you look for a vehicle that will carry your political agenda. And
He started out that way, didn't he? At
Oh,
Harvard.
absolutely, you know, and so there are so many of these professional politicians around now, and they latch onto it. But that creates a problem, by the way, because one of the things that happens to bureaucrats in the weather office, they're trying to convince the politician of something. But once they've convinced them, that bureaucrat's now on a treadmill, right? You're not going to go and say, hey, what I told you is wrong, and your whole political career is out the window. It is not going to happen. And that's another part of what's driving it. Now, that's why, of course, that having somebody like Gore, and incidentally, I've never understood why Hansen was not charged under the Hatch Act for his public activities as a civil servant or, you know, bureaucrat. And when I spoke to his boss, John Tian, because Hansen had claimed the Bush White House was interfering with him, I spoke to John Tian, ironically, at the last Washington conference by the Heartland, and I said, was he being interfered with? And he said, absolutely not. It wasn't happening at all. And I said, well, why didn't he get charged under the Hatch Act for protesting outside the White House and flying to England and participating in a Greenpeace trial and so on?
Well, just anybody that attends a Bilderberger is Hatch Act violation.
Well, exactly. And John's comment was, he said, the word came down from above, leave him alone. And I said, from above, what does that mean? And he said, from above.
Yeah, we don't know who these people are, do we?
No, we don't. We wouldn't have a clue who would try to influence. My concern now is the long term, because the damage to science that is going on, and it's being amplified by the fact that cholesterol's going to kill you, and then cholesterol's okay, and the public are so confused now, and then to have this exposed of deliberate corruption of science for a political agenda. And the other thing is that
It goes very deep too, doesn't it? It goes right on down to the grade school level.
exactly, and that's one of the things, by the way, that's changed is when I started out, it was the old professors that had the old views, and the new young people came in and challenged those. Now it's the opposite. The young are coming in totally indoctrinated, and it's the old guys like me that are saying,
There's a bunch of old people here.
so they flipped the whole thing. So there's that problem of the credibility of science. The other thing that bothers me is environmentalism was necessary. It was a very good new paradigm. It's like feminism. The problem is that people taking it to extremes and using it for a political agenda. And the public who don't want to make change, they're loath to change because they know when change occurs, someone wins and someone loses, and they might lose. And so they're going to start saying, we don't believe anything you tell us. And that's really concerning to me. And just to give you an example, in the early days, people used to say to me, well, you're giving comfort to the polluters. And that bothered me for a while. And then I realized that in the long term, if you lie about the science, you're providing more ammunition for the polluters to say, hey, those guys lied to you. We're going to do what we want.
How do you account for oil being interested in this conference? I mean, impact.
Well, of course, whenever you set up a false straw man, you need a bogeyman. And of course, the oil companies are a nice target. It's going on, Wall Street. Obama's using Wall Street, and Idi Amin used the East Asians in Uganda, and Hitler used the Jews. You have to have your bogeyman, and of course, everybody hates bankers. That's the
Bankers and oil.
the bankers in oil, yeah, and especially the oil. So
These
yeah,
bankers.
yeah. So I think it's important upon us now to start thinking forward and saying, no, we need environmentalism.
Do you think they're going to announce publicly the notion of geoengineering as a necessary curative? Because they've been sort of silent and hiding the whole phenomenon until recently.
No, I think that the pattern of attack is shifting, and all you have to do is look at the list of issues that the Club of Rome identified as targets, because what you need is something that's global, that transcends national boundaries. And of course, climate was a perfect one. And the issue they're now working on is water. And you see that with the EPA using water to take away land rights and take away the people's property. And they've already started using the phrase peak water. And of course, peak oil was a very important thing in the climate issue. And so the target is shifting, because the one thing about these people is they're aware what will win and what will lose.
So I think they're in a hurry. I mean, COP21 seems like they're pushing it really hard to implement a carbon tax.
Well, COP21 they're seeing as simply the last chance. And
So
yeah.
It's a final.
And that's why. I mean, if you look at what's the pressure on COP21, first of all, Obama's made it his foreign and domestic legacy, okay, climate change. And the second is that you've got more and more people starting to question the science of climate. When you look at that UN poll where 7 million people listed climate change as the 16th concern in a list of 16. And the politicians, these people are aware of those things. The Pew Center poll showing climate change right at the bottom of people's concerns. So they're losing the public, and they understand that. The next thing is, of course, that you've got countries that are saying we're not going to sign on.
And the whole of Russia. And
Russia, China, India, even Japan announced they're going to build 40 coal-burning plants in the next 7 years. So they realize they're losing that political battle, and so that's why the big push right now to COP21. But they're all, as I said, they'll slide away from it. And the interesting question is, at what point will the politicians realize that it's safe enough to abandon the climate change without being accused of being anti-environmental? You know, most of those politicians are doing, and I know the Canadian person who, Harper, you know, was as open as anybody at the G7, but nonetheless, they put on the cloak of green. All right, and what they're finding is the cloak of green is getting increasingly heavy and increasingly damaging to their political careers because economies are being destroyed by it. And I mean, you look at Germany, their green energy or their green policies, Spain. I mean, you look at every country that's tried it. The interesting one is Ontario, Canada, where the whole energy policy was set up by Maurice Strong when he was head of Ontario Hydro. And he did that in the same year, 1992, that he took over there as he ran the conference at the Rio.
Was that Mark Harris that was led of him?
No. It was the NDP leader before that. I can't think of his name. Yeah, Ray, exactly.
Ray.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I said, I think that they see COP21 as a last chance, but they're very good at disassociating themselves, cutting loose, and going and finding other targets to perpetuate.
Did they want to do more at COP20 and prove? Did that fail? Or did
Yeah, no, it failed. And of course, you start to...
How did it fail?
Well, because already China and India were becoming or saying that we're not interested, and it's very interesting because I was involved in the ozone hole issue, and the ozone issue was a forerunner. That's why they keep talking about the Montreal Protocol that can work, and they say, well, the Kyoto Protocol can work because the Montreal Protocol worked. It was a completely false scientific thing. And there are certain people who are in both. Susan Solomon, who's at NOAA, she was the one that said there's scientific proof that CFCs are in the ozone layer. Well, it never was, never happened. And then she became a co-author of the IPCC reports on the science side. The whole notion of the science dictating, and then as the science starts to fail, then they have to retrench.
Wow, it's a big retrench, isn't it? I mean, all the way down to grade school, kindergarten.
Well, exactly. But as you know, that idea of getting the children started with Ignatius Loyola, and that interests me too. There's an interesting connection there because the current Pope, I think, deliberately took the name Francis because he wanted to be believed to be a Franciscan. Because St. Francis of Assisi gave up all of his wealth and power.
He's not a Franciscan?
No, he's a Jesuit.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And who are the Jesuits? Ignatius Loyola. And who was the guy that said, give me the child and I'll give you the man? Ignatius Loyola. And so I think that Francis is
A ringer.
yeah, I think he's...
Are you Catholic?
I'm now in the largest religious group in the world, lapsed Catholics.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
It's a better group to be in than others.
But of course, it's the old problem that, as George Bernard Shaw said, Christianity is the greatest thing in the world. It's just a pity nobody ever tried it. And it's not the religion that's the problem, it's the church. And of course, the church, you see this throughout history. I've studied this extensively. Every idea, everything starts with an idea, whether it's a country or a company or whatever. But that you then need a structure in order to disseminate that idea. And the structure very rapidly becomes more important than the idea. But structures are rigid, whereas ideas have to be dynamic to continue. And the classic example, of course, is, as the Pope knows, Martin Luther said the structures become more important than the idea, and he caused the Reformation. And so these are all patterns of history and human behavior that, if you look at them from a Machiavellian point of view, and I mention that name deliberately because for most people, he's the personification of evil. And the reason that he became that was because he dared to say that people are not good. And if you create a society and laws based on the idea that people are good, you'll create, for example, a legal system that protects the guilty, which is precisely what we're suffering from now. And a lot of people are starting to realize that Machiavelli was right. But the church, of course, had to make Machiavelli the bad guy, because they were saying, no, they're not born good, but we baptize them and therefore they're good. And so the same thing happens with all of these ideas, and evolve over time. Yeah. One of the interesting problems has been, first of all, the content, or what the air is made up of, and the second problem is the percentages of gases in the air and their distribution. And of course, if you go to the public and you say, well, what's the most important greenhouse gas? They say CO2. And then what do you say? Well, no, it's less than 4% of the total greenhouse gases, which are less than 4% of the total atmospheric gases. And the minute you start talking numbers and percentages, the majority of people, their eyes glaze over. And so that exploitation of percentages and numbers of the gases to get the focus on CO2 is what has driven the whole debate. And it's one of the things that I've been talking about and trying to draw people's attention to. Now, people try to present the percentages in different diagrams. For example, the pie diagram, where you get, you get nitrogen and oxygen, and then the greenhouse gases, and then that's broken down into another pie chart, and where it's 90% or 95% water vapor, and less than that. And where you see that problem showing up is, I've got a slide that was on the ABC News website, and it shows the major greenhouse gases: CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. Doesn't even mention water vapor. Water vapor, which is not even in the graph, and yet. And the reason that came to my attention, because I had a grade 11 student doing a project, and he sent me this graph, and he said, I was going to use this in my high school report, and I suddenly realized how wrong it was. And yet here it was on ABC News website. But that deliberate focusing, and one of the ways to understand what they've done is everything is designed to demonize CO2. So you then remove anything that distracts from that. And the pie chart and percentages charts are deliberately designed to do that. The Heritage Foundation tried another method where they took a block, like a grid with different squares, and they said, okay, here's the total atmosphere, and then one of the squares they expanded into the greenhouse gases, and then the few of those that were CO2 were isolated. And it's an attempt at a visual imagery. But the minute you take the greenhouse gases out of the total atmosphere and create their own graph, the public are lost. They don't grasp, but this is, you have to say, no, this is 100% of the greenhouse gases, but they're only 4% of the total gases. So it's a combination of perception problems, of statistical deception, and as you know, the old thing, lies, damn lies, and statistics, but all done with a political purpose. If it was done for a scientific purpose, the whole thing would be presented very differently. But it's been done for a political purpose, as I said, to demonize CO2. And you say to the public, what's the most important? In fact, Yale University did a survey amongst the public, and 77% failed the Yale test on climate change. And that Yale, who obviously were getting paid to produce a result, curved the results. And they said that the reason they had to curve the results was the questions were too hard. Hello? If they're too hard, you obviously don't know anything about climate, and you don't know what the public knows. So the whole thing, they had to publish it because they've been paid to do the research. And so they tried to mask over the failures, but it speaks directly to your question about the composition of the atmosphere. If you have the total atmospheric gases, nitrogen and oxygen, which are 98% of it, and then the greenhouse gases, the majority of which is water vapor, the CO2, which is one of those greenhouse gases, would be 0.04% of the total pie chart.
And in the past?
In the past, it's varied between, well, millions of years ago, it was 5,000 parts per million, so it would have been 50 parts. Now it's 0.04. When you look at the geologic record, and it's reproduced over 600 million years, what you see is the level of CO2 has been as high as 7,000 parts per million. And there are periods like the Ordovician, about 328 million years ago, where you had CO2 levels of 5,000 parts per million and you had an ice age. And the chart, when you plot the CO2 level against temperature, there is no correlation whatsoever between CO2 and temperature. And when Al Gore says that CO2 levels are at the highest ever, it's simply false. They're at the lowest ever. And that happens to be a problem because as you get below 100, down to 150 parts per million, in other words 0.015%, the plants start to die. And so the average CO2 level for the last 300 million years has been around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million, which is 3 times the current level. And yet Al Gore is saying the current level is dangerous. And what's interesting is that in that 300 million years, plants evolved. And plants, we know, because of the work of Sherwood Idso on injecting CO2 into plants, increasing their growth. And we also know from commercial greenhouses, the Dutch have been pumping CO2 into greenhouses for over 100 years. And they found that when the levels are at 1,200 parts per million, in other words, 3 times the present, the plant growth yields are 4 times as great. And what I've argued is that the plants currently are malnourished for CO2. And we do know also that there is about 2 bushels of the increase in crop yields in North America is due to the increase in CO2 since the Industrial Revolution. So when you start to look at the historic record, none of what they're saying about CO2 holds up. It's another interesting thing about why they came with the 97% consensus. Because if the consensus was only 70%, enough of the public would say, well, 30% are questioning. That's a pretty large percentage. But 3%, you can easily marginalize 3%. That's why those numbers are done. And now what's happening is that the personal attacks, because again, they know they're losing the argument, but they're under the pressure of 4 things, and I'll itemize these in my talk. One is Obama's foreign and domestic policy is now totally built around, his legacy is going to be built around climate change. He's announced that. The second question is that the public in all the polls are showing they're not interested. It's not a concern for them. The third thing is that there are countries that are saying we're not interested either. India and China just saying we don't care. It's not an issue. And in fact, India took the moral high ground when India came out and said, okay, you're telling us that global temperature might increase 0.5 degree in the next 60 years, but you're not even sure of that, and you're telling us we've got to stop development and growth. We got people starving to death. And what that did was it stole the moral high ground back, right? So they were saying, well, oh, we're saving the planet, we're saving, and then suddenly India comes along and says, no, our priorities are different. And so that was an important thing. And the fourth thing that's putting the pressure on, of course, is Paris. And this is their last chance. They know this is their last chance to try and get an international treaty and a carbon tax and control by the United Nations of the whole economy of the world. And so those are the 4 reasons that the personal attacks have increased again now. And you saw the attacks on Willie Soon have increased. I'm getting them again. And it's because of the political pressure they're under and seeing that they're not going to be able to achieve their goals. And that's why I'm optimistic, because I think that, and my last comment in my speech today is going to be that Gandhi said, there's 4 phases. That first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, then you win. Well, we're in the attack phase now. And so I think that, and I sense it at this conference compared to the first conference 10 years ago. And so that's what's going on, and that's why the personal attacks occur. As soon as somebody starts attacking you personally, you know they've lost the argument.